On August 3rd, 2023, tragedy struck when a mudslide in Shovi, located in Georgia's mountainous region of Racha, occurred, claiming the lives of at least 32 individuals and requiring the evacuation of over 200 people. In summer 2015, flooding struck the country's capital, Tbilisi, resulting in 20 deaths. Recurring forest fires, first in 2008 and again in 2017, destroyed large swaths of the Borjomi-Kharagauli National Park. Aside from these events sharing in their devastating impact, they also share in stirring anger and frustration among Georgians toward the state for its lackluster response and failure to prevent such disasters. Furthermore, they have brought rising concerns of climate change to the national stage. Welcome to the CRRC Georgia podcast. Today we're exploring the critical question, to what extent are Georgians concerned about climate change? To understand where Georgians stand on this issue, CRRC Georgia conducted a comprehensive survey examining public attitudes toward climate change, its perceived impacts, and views on climate policy. The 2024 study, Attitudes Towards Climate Change in Georgia, was completed by CRRC Georgia with support from the National Endowment for Democracy. Its findings reveal a public that is significantly more alarmed about climate change than one might expect, yet faces important gaps in understanding certain aspects of the climate crisis. Today we'll walk through these findings systematically, exploring not just whether Georgians are concerned, but how deeply that concern runs, what specific impacts worry them most, and what they believe should be done about it. An exploration of our central question, to what extent are Georgians concerned about climate change, reveals interesting layers of nuance. When asked to identify the top issues facing the country, Georgians did not prioritize climate change. Only 2% named climate change among the country's most pressing problems, while 5% mentioned environmental protection. Combined, just 7% of respondents identified either issue as a top national concern. For context, poverty was named 18%, education by 11%, and territorial integrity by 10%. This finding might suggest limited concern. However, when we examine the question differently, a different picture emerges. When asked directly about the importance of climate change as an issue, 90% of respondents indicated it was either important or very important to them personally. Specifically, 59% described it as very important and 31% as important. Only 9% considered it somewhat important or less. This apparent contradiction, low salience but high importance, tells us something crucial. Georgians may not view climate change as the most urgent issue requiring immediate political attention, but they do recognize its significance. The issue matters to them even if other concerns take priority. When we look at worry specifically, the pattern reinforces this conclusion. 80% of Georgians report being worried about climate change, 38% very worried, and 42% somewhat worried. Only 20% are not very worried or not worried at all. However, there's a significant gap in understanding causation. Despite high levels of concern, only 32% of Georgians believe climate change is primarily caused by human action. The plurality, 42%, attribute it to a mixture of natural causes and human activity, while 21% believe it's primarily due to natural causes. Just 1% deny climate change is happening at all. This finding reveals an important disconnect. With only 1/3 of Georgians fully accepting scientific consensus that the primary cause of climate change is from human activity and is worsened by it, suggests that public education on climate science remains incomplete, even among a population that is otherwise quite concerned about the issue. Georgians' concern about climate change translates into clear preferences regarding energy sources. The public demonstrates decidedly positive attitudes towards clean energy and correspondingly negative views toward fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. Solar power receives the most favorable assessment, followed by wind power. Hydroelectric power, despite being Georgia's dominant electricity source and somewhat controversial due to its land impacts and a driver of rural displacement, is viewed relatively positively, with 54% holding favorable opinions. Among fossil fuels, natural gas receives the most positive assessment, while coal and nuclear power are viewed most negatively. When these attitudes are consolidated into a clean energy index, the average score reaches 59 out of 100, where higher scores indicate more positive attitudes toward renewables and more negative attitudes towards fossil fuels. Women, people with a higher education, and opposition supporters tend to score higher on this index. Interestingly, when asked about having various types of energy infrastructure near their homes, support remains strong for renewables but shows a degree of not in my backyard thinking. 70% would support solar panels on buildings, 56% would support a solar park, and 57% would support an onshore wind farm. In stark contrast, only 12 to 17% would support coal, oil, or gas-fired power plants near their homes, with nuclear power stations receiving the least support at just 3%. Georgians' concern about climate change is closely tied to observed and anticipated impacts. The data reveals a public that is not abstractly worried about a distant problem, but rather sees climate change as something affecting their lives and communities right now. When asked about the most important climate and environment related issues, deforestation topped the list at 53%, followed closely by air pollution at 50%. Extreme weather events were named by 39%, while waste accumulation concerned 26% and global warming or higher temperatures worried 20%. Crucially, 75% of the public report personally witnessing changes in their local weather patterns in recent years. When asked what specific changes they've noticed, 38% cite unusually warm weather for the time of year, 33% mention heavy rain or flooding, 24% have observed sudden weather changes, and 20% have experienced droughts or heat waves. These aren't merely abstract observations. 74% of Georgians agree that they have personally experienced unusual weather they take as clear proof of climate change. This personal experiential knowledge appears to ground their concern in tangible reality rather than distant projections. When asked about future impacts, overwhelming majorities believe climate change will harm various groups and places. 93% believe it will harm future generations either a great deal or a moderate amount. 90% think it will harm the planet. 89% believe it will harm people in Georgia. 87% expect harm to their local community. And 83% anticipate personal harm. The pattern here is consistent with global trends. People perceive greater impact on future generations and the world at large than on themselves personally, but a majority of Georgians expect harm at all levels, a sign of substantial concern. Perhaps most striking is public attribution of recent disasters to climate change. When asked whether specific recent catastrophic events were made more likely by climate change, 85% said the Guria landslides were more probable due to climate change. 81% said the same of the Shovi landslide. 78% attributed increased probability to the June 2015 Tbilisi floods, and 70% believed the Borjomi wildfires were more likely because of climate change. Given the levels of concern and perceived impacts we've discussed, it's perhaps unsurprising that Georgians express strong support for climate action, though with some interesting patterns in the details. 75% of Georgians believe the government is not doing enough on climate change. Only 14% think the government is doing about the right amount, and just 2% believe it should do less. This represents a clear mandate for increased governmental action. Notably, 52% of the public believes that taking action to reduce climate change will help the economy, compared to only 8% who think it will hurt economic growth. This economic optimism about climate action is significant, as concerns about economic costs often serve as barriers to climate policy in many countries. When it comes to paying for climate action, 48% of respondents express willingness to pay extra taxes if the government were taking effective action on climate change. While this falls short of a majority, it represents a substantial portion of the population willing to bear direct financial costs for climate policy. Support for specific policies is generally strong. Subsidies for energy-efficient heating systems receive 94% support, improvements to home insulation 91%, and solar panel subsidies 89%. Requiring new construction to run on electricity rather than gas receives 58% support. The public is more divided on banning the sale of gasoline and natural gas vehicles from 2030, with 44% supporting and 40% opposing this measure. On average, Georgians support 5 out of 7 climate policies presented in the survey, indicating broad-based support for meaningful climate action across multiple policy domains. One area where public understanding appears less aligned with scientific consensus concerns individual actions. Georgians tend to believe that driving an electric car, using public transportation, and recycling have large impacts on reducing individual carbon footprints. However, they underestimate the climate benefits of dietary changes. Only 6% believe not eating meat has a large impact, and 5% say the same about not eating dairy. In reality, scientists consistently rank dietary changes, particularly reducing meat and dairy consumption, among the most impactful individual actions alongside flying less. Meanwhile, recycling, while positive, has relatively modest climate benefits compared to those other actions. Before we examine how Georgia compares internationally, let's outline how this research was conducted. The data comes from a nationally representative telephone survey of 1,299 respondents conducted in December 2023. The questionnaire was designed to measure a wide range of concepts related to climate change, incorporating questions from other international surveys to enable comparative analysis. Importantly, the survey included the 6 Americas Super Short Survey Segmentation Questionnaire, which allows us to categorize the Georgian population according to their climate attitudes and compare Georgia's profile with that of other countries worldwide. So, how does Georgia compare to other countries in terms of climate attitudes? The Six Americas segmentation model divides populations into 6 categories: the alarmed, who see climate change as a severe present problem; the concerned, who see it as a serious but more distant problem; the cautious, who are uncertain; the disengaged, who lack information; the doubtful, who question whether it's happening or problematic; and the dismissive, who view it as a conspiracy. The findings place Georgia in a striking position internationally. 56% of Georgians fall into the alarmed category, 27% are concerned, 10% cautious, 2% doubtful, and 5% dismissive. Notably, 0% are categorized as disengaged. This distribution places Georgia 26th out of 111 countries for which data is available, firmly in the top quarter of countries with alarmed populations. Georgia's climate attitude profile most closely resembles the Philippines, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, and differs most dramatically from Norway, Czechia, and Yemen. Within the South Caucasus region, Georgia stands out remarkably. While 56% of Georgians are alarmed about climate change, only 32% of Azerbaijanis and 18% of Armenians fall into this category. Georgia's neighboring countries have much larger shares in the cautious category, suggesting more uncertainty about climate change. This international positioning is significant. It indicates that Georgian concern about climate change is not only substantial in absolute terms, but is high by global standards, surpassing many wealthier countries with longer histories of climate discourse. So, to return to our central question, to what extent are Georgians concerned about climate change? The answer is substantially and increasingly so. While climate change does not top the list of Georgia's most pressing national problems, it is nevertheless a concern among an overwhelming majority of Georgians. 80% are worried about it, 90% consider it important, and 56% are sufficiently alarmed to place them in the most concerned category in international comparative terms. This concern is grounded in observed reality. 3/4 of Georgians have witnessed changes in local weather patterns, and similar proportions have experienced unusual weather they interpret as proof of climate change. Large majorities believe recent disasters, the Shovi and Guria landslides, the Tbilisi floods, the Borjomi fires, were made more likely by climate change. Georgians express clear preferences for clean energy over fossil fuels and support a wide range of climate policies. 3/4 believe the government should do more, and roughly half are willing to pay additional taxes for effective climate action. Optimism about climate action's economic benefits outweigh pessimism by a significant margin. The overall picture is one of a population that is notably concerned about climate change, has witnessed its impacts firsthand, and is calling for a more robust governmental response. In a global context, Georgian public opinion on climate change stands out for its high level of alarm and concern. As climate impacts intensify and public discourse continues to evolve, these attitudes will likely shape Georgia's climate policy trajectory in the years ahead. The question is no longer whether Georgians care about climate change, clearly they do, but rather whether policy will rise to meet public concern and scientific necessity. Thank you for listening to the CRRC Georgia podcast. For the full research cited in this episode, follow the link in the episode description. For more information about CRRC Georgia and research like this, check out our website, crrc.ge, and make sure to follow us on social media at CRRC Georgia. Until next time.